Okay, so you want to lay siege to a kingdom. Your army is camped outside a castle. Your banners. Your siege towers creeping toward the walls. Your trebuchets hurling stones all day long, while the men inside drop fire on your heads. Every morning your men wake up hungry. Every morning your horses need more than they can graze. Every morning somebody hands you another bill, for food, for fodder, for engineers, for timber, for the thousand small things an army eats through just by existing. That's the picture. That's what the tapestries and the movies sell you. Here's what the picture doesn't show you. That army is losing money every single day, and it is usually losing it faster than the defenders are losing anything at all. The castle isn't in danger, your treasury is. And the story of how a siege actually works, and how it bankrupted kings, is one of the strangest stories in all of medieval finance. By the end of this, you'll understand why the most dangerous thing a medieval king could do to his own money was win a siege. Before we talk about money, we need to talk about money. We need to talk what a siege actually is. Because if you picture medieval warfare as one famous battle after another, helmets clashing in an open field, Crécy here, Agincourt there, you have the whole thing backwards. Pitched battles were the rare exception, the gamble that kings avoided whenever they could. The normal way war was fought in the Middle Ages was to march an army to someone's walls, sit down, and wait. A campaign season was mostly waiting. Most of a siege wasn't fighting at all. It was digging trenches, raising engines, waiting for news, burying men who died of fever, and watching the grain carts roll in, or fail to roll in. Sieges outnumbered open battles so heavily that the famous battlefield is the oddity, not the rule, which raises an obvious question. If you can't just rush the walls, how does a siege ever get decided? Here's the first thing nobody tells you about medieval warfare. You almost never take a castle by storming it. Historians who study this stuff estimate that to have any real chance of taking a defended fortress by direct assault, you needed somewhere between 4 and 10 attackers for every single defender inside. And even then, the assault usually failed. The history of medieval warfare is full of armies that broke themselves against walls they never touched. It is almost empty of walls falling in an afternoon. Defenders had the high ground, the thick stone, the arrows, and the simple fact that attacking a wall means climbing while someone drops things on your head. So the smart move, the normal move, was the one thing that doesn't look heroic at all. You surrounded the castle, and you waited for the people inside to run out of food. That's the entire logic of a siege in one sentence. You don't break the walls, you break the supply line. The castle was designed to hold out for months, and the only way to beat that design was to be willing to wait longer than the people inside could survive. And this is where the economics get strange. Because of all the unfair advantages in medieval warfare, the biggest one belonged to the side that looked like it was losing. The defender was cheap. A castle needed a small garrison, a few hundred men, sitting inside walls that were already paid for, eating food that was already stocked, drinking water that was already there. The defender's biggest costs happened years earlier, when the castle was built and filled, and even that was ruinous. Richard I spent more on a single fortress, Château Gaillard, than he did on all of his other castles combined. Fortification was expensive. The point is the defender paid it once, up front, and then sat inside it for free. The attacker, by contrast, was a walking disaster of daily expenses, thousands of men who had to be fed, horses that ate more than the men, armor and weapons that wore out, timber and rope and metal for siege engines, wagons to drag it all across the countryside. Everything the army needed arrived by cart and by ship and by forced purchase from villages along the way, and every mile of that supply line was another place for the whole operation to fail, and none of that stopped for a single day. Here's what the daily meter actually looked like, because this is where the abstraction turns into a number you can hold. Take a field army of 10,000 men. In the English royal payroll records of the 1300s, a foot soldier earned around 2 or 3 pence a day. A mounted archer earned about 6. A knight earned 2 shillings, which is 24 pence. Now, armies weren't all knights, so let's be generous to the king and call the average across the whole force 3 pence a day. 10,000 men at 3 pence is 30,000 pence a day. There are 240 pence in a pound. Do the math, that's 125 pounds a day just in wages. 1 month of sitting at the walls, nearly 4,000 pounds. A siege that lasts the better part of a year, over 40,000 pounds. And that's only the wage line. Add the bread, the salt meat, the ale, the fodder for the horses, the wagon hire, the engineers, the carpenters, and the true daily number climbs far past 125 pounds. The meter didn't just tick, it roared. Read that again. Wages alone could run a king into more than 40,000 pounds for one castle, and the whole thing hadn't even started working yet. There's a reason so many sieges ended not because the walls fell, but because the army outside ran out of food or money first. The side with the giant army, the siege towers, and the momentum could lose to an empty stomach and an empty purse before it ever touched the stone. So where does the money come from? That's the question that gets to the heart of why sieges destroyed kings. Because here's the trap that catches every new ruler. A medieval king did not actually have an army that he paid for out of a budget. What he had was a system of obligation. His nobles and their men owed him military service, but that service was not unlimited. Traditionally, a knight owed about 40 days of campaigning a year. After that, the obligation ended, and if the king wanted the army to stay, he had to pay for it in cash. Think about what that means during a siege. Your siege is not over in 40 days, it's over in months, sometimes a year. So the clock starts ticking and the meter starts running. The same knights who showed up because they owed you now show up because you're paying them. And suddenly your glorious siege is not an army at all, it's a payroll. It's a payroll that needs feeding. A payroll that needs paying every week. A payroll that dissolves the moment the money stops. And when the money did stop, the army didn't go home politely. Men whose pay was in arrears went looking for plunder on their own account. Others simply vanished in the night. An army paid by obligation fought for a season. An army paid in coin fought until the coin ran out, and then it stopped being an army. And here's the second problem, the one that makes the whole thing feel almost absurd. A king's ordinary income could not cover it. Medieval kings did not have a national budget or a big cash cushion sitting in a vault. Their money came from the royal lands, from the courts, from taxes that had to be argued for and collected, and it arrived slowly and unevenly. A single serious siege could cost more than a year of the whole kingdom's income. We have a documented example of exactly this from England in the 1100s. When King Stephen besieged Exeter Castle, the campaign reportedly cost around £10,000. £10,000, by the way, was something like 5 times Stephen's estimated annual income, and Exeter wasn't alone. At another English siege, the chroniclers claimed the cost swallowed the income of 10 whole counties. 10 counties. For one castle, let that land for a moment. A king of England could spend more than a year's entire royal revenue on one castle. And the daily wage meter we just ran would have blown through that number 4 times over in a single year at the walls. There was no credit card, no emergency fund, no bailout waiting at the end. The money had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is where the story gets truly strange. Because when a king's own money ran out, and it always ran out, he didn't just give up, he borrowed. A king couldn't simply seize the wealth he needed, not without strangling the trade and the loyalty that produced it. So he went looking for money the way any overextended borrower does. He borrowed. And the people who lent him money were the most unlikely creditors in medieval Europe. For centuries, kings borrowed from whoever had cash, and that often meant Jewish communities, who were barred from most trades, and ended up in lending partly because it was one of the few things they were allowed to do. But by the 1200s, a bigger machine had appeared. The Italian merchant bankers. The great banking houses of Florence and Lucca had built a vast network of lending across Europe, and they were the only institutions on the planet big enough to finance a king's war. Here's how the relationship worked. The king needed cash now. The bankers had cash now. The king's collateral was the future. Specifically, the wool trade. England's single most valuable export. Not just valuable, irreplaceable. England's wool wasn't just cloth material. It was the cash crop of the age, sold by the bale to the weavers of Flanders and Italy. And the duties on it were the most reliable income a king had. Picture a dock on the English coast in the 1300s. A ship is being loaded with wool bales, and every one of those bales is already promised to a counting house in Lucca. The merchant standing on the dock doesn't think of himself as financing a siege, but that's exactly what he's doing. The king would hand the bankers the right to collect the customs duties on wool, and in exchange, the bankers handed over the silver that paid for the army at the walls. It was the medieval equivalent of putting your country's biggest industry up as collateral for a payday loan, and the terms were brutal. We're talking about loans at interest rates that could run from roughly 14% all the way up to 66%, and sometimes far higher in desperate times. And the bankers weren't naive. They knew exactly what they were financing. They charged what the risk was worth, because lending to a king was a gamble, and they knew it. You don't need to be a finance person to understand what that does to a balance sheet. A siege that already costs more than a year's income, financed at rates like that, turns into a debt that grows every single month the siege continues. Edward I of England borrowed somewhere around £500,000 from a single banking house, the Ricciardi of Lucca, over the course of his reign, secured against the wool customs. £500,000. Let's put that number where you can see it. That's 50 times what King Stephen's entire siege of Exeter cost, and it was all tied up in the same machine. War first, payment later. Think of the wool customs as a toll booth at every port, and the king had just handed the keys to his bankers. The wool bales at the docks weren't just merchandise, they were the kingdom's credit card, and here's what happened when that credit card maxed out. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this is the point where a royal siege stopped being a royal problem and started being a European financial crisis. By the 1300s, the two biggest banks in the world were the Bardi and the Peruzzi of Florence, and the biggest borrower in Europe was Edward III of England, who was financing a war with France on a scale no king had ever attempted. Edward borrowed from the Bardi and the Peruzzi on a massive scale. The sums were so large that the banks had stretched themselves to the edge of their capital just to stay in the game, which is exactly why the game ending would hurt them so badly. When the war turned against him, when the money stopped flowing in, he did what every overextended borrower eventually does: he defaulted. And the consequences didn't stop at the king's door. In a counting house in Florence, a clerk who had spent years writing down royal loans suddenly had to write down something else. The Peruzzi failed in about 1343. The Bardi failed right after, around 1346. The two greatest banking houses in Europe, the institutions that financed trade across the entire continent, collapsed under the weight of royal war debt. Historians still debate exactly how much of that collapse was Edward's default and how much was other problems inside the banks themselves, but the connection is not seriously disputed. A king's siege had reached out from a muddy field in France and taken down banks in Italy. Read that again. The money that paid for the siege came from Florence, and when the king couldn't pay it back, Florence paid the price. Now, if you want to see the whole machine running at once, there's one siege that shows it better than any other. The Siege of Calais. It's the perfect case study because it has everything: the giant army, the ruinous cost, the loan machine humming in the background, and the kind of ending that makes you ask whether winning was even worth it. In September of 1346, Edward III marched his victorious army up to the walls of Calais, a heavily fortified port on the northern coast of France. He had just won the Battle of Crecy. He was the most feared king in Europe, and then he sat down in the mud and stayed there for 11 months. 11 months. A siege that long wasn't a campaign, it was a town project, a supply operation and a payroll, all parked in the mud in front of one set of walls. Calais was built to withstand exactly this: double moats, massive walls, a garrison under an experienced commander, and a harbor that could be resupplied by sea. For the first winter and spring, French ships ran supplies and reinforcements straight into the town, right past the English army. Edward's army was enormous, and an enormous army in one place breeds its own problems: camp fever, desertion, supply wagons stuck in autumn mud. The fortified new town he built outside the walls wasn't a luxury, it was survival. And here's the part that tells you everything about siege economics. Edward didn't break the walls, he couldn't. So instead, he built an entire new town outside Calais, a fortified camp complete with market days, to house and feed his army through the winter. He brought in a naval blockade built on hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors, by the counts of the day, to keep his own army fed and to cut the town off from the sea. And in late spring, the English finally managed to block the harbor entrance completely. The town could no longer be resupplied. From that moment on, it was a pure race between two starving things: the garrison inside the walls and the treasury outside them. That's the moment most history books skip, because it's not glamorous. The people of Calais ate their horses. They ate their dogs. They begged the French king to come save them, and he marched north with a relief army, looked at the English position, and turned around and went home, because his own treasury was exhausted and his own army was falling apart. The town surrendered in August of 1347, after almost a year, when the food ran out completely. And then came the human cost that no ledger can capture. According to the chronicler who recorded it, the town's leading citizens, 6 of them, walked out of the gates barefoot, in nothing but their shirts, with ropes around their necks, to offer their own lives so the rest of the town could live. Edward ordered them put to death. It was his own queen who finally knelt and begged him to spare them, and he did. It's one of the most famous moments in the chronicle, and it survived because it was so human. A king who had spent a fortune and a year to take this town, stopped by his own wife over the lives of 6 men. Think about that moment. 6 men walked out expecting to die so their neighbors could eat. That's what it means to run out of food in a siege. That's the human face of the thing we've been counting in pence and pounds. Edward won, the gates opened, the flag went up, and then the bill arrived. Here is the counterintuitive part, and it's the heart of the whole story. Winning the siege didn't fix the finances, it made them worse. The English crown's finances were, in the words of the historians who study this period, in ruins after Calais. And he wasn't alone. The French king's treasury was exhausted too. Both sides had spent so much on this one town that the war basically had to stop. A truce was signed within weeks, and it held for years, not because the two kings made peace, but because neither of them had any money left to keep fighting. And the cost didn't stay in France. It followed the money home into the wool trade, into the taxes, into the lending houses that had bet everything on a king. Think about what that means. A single city, a single siege, 11 months. And it was enough to break the bank accounts of two of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe at the same time. That's what a siege actually was. Not a test of courage, a test of who could keep paying to eat longer. And this is the trap that almost nobody sees coming, because the visible sign of success was the most misleading number in all of medieval warfare. Look at an army camped outside a castle and you see power. Thousands of men, banners, engines, horses. It looks like the strongest thing on the planet, but the stronger it looked, the more fragile it actually was. A medieval army sitting at a siege was a melting ice cube. Disease swept through camps faster than through any town. Camps bred fever the way towns bred gossip. Dysentery and plague killed more men outside the walls than arrows ever did inside them, and every empty tent was a wage that no longer needed paying, because the man was gone. Desertion ran away with unpaid soldiers in the night. A force that looked unstoppable in August could be half its size by spring, not because the enemy beat it, but because the money ran out. And even when the siege succeeded, the prize often arrived ruined. A town that had eaten its horses and its dogs, that had sent 6 of its own citizens out to die, was not exactly a profitable acquisition. The conquest didn't repay the cost of the conquest. The winner got a starving, depopulated town and a mountain of debt. The town that surrendered was a ruin. Its trade was gone. The very thing that made Calais worth taking had been destroyed by the blockade that took it. That's why so many medieval wars ended the way they did, not with a glorious surrender, but with a quietly exhausted king doing the math and realizing the victory had cost more than the whole kingdom was worth. So did any king ever actually make siege warfare work? Yes, and the difference between the ones who survived and the ones who drowned is the most useful lesson in this entire story. The kings who made war pay were the ones who made sure the revenue followed the conquest. They took ransoms from captured nobles, and a single high-ranking prisoner could be worth a fortune. They taxed the land they conquered. They called parliaments and convinced them to grant new taxes. Those grants never came free. Every new tax arrived with conditions, with complaints, with a parliament that wanted something back. Kings who managed that relationship kept the meter fed. Kings who couldn't were left holding the bill, and the kings who drowned were the ones who treated war as a one-way expense. They spent the crown's cash, borrowed the banker's cash, and then stood in an empty treasury, holding a victory that produced nothing. The same crown could fight the same kind of war and end up either richer or bankrupt, depending entirely on whether the money flowed back in. That's the conditional answer, and it's the honest one. Siege warfare wasn't always suicide. It was a bet on whether the conquest would refill the treasury faster than the meter could drain it. And that brings us back to the original picture. And the reason this story is so strange. When you picture a medieval siege, you see the castle as the thing under attack. The walls, the towers, the flag. That was never the real battlefield. The real battlefield was the king's treasury, and the king was losing that fight more often than he won it. The castle was already paid for and already stocked. The army outside it was a daily invoice that never stopped printing. The king wasn't besieging the castle, he was besieging his own solvency. And the people who paid the price were the ones holding the paper. The bankers in Florence, the merchants at the docks, the wool growers whose entire industry was collateral for a war they never voted for. The next time you see a medieval siege in a movie, with the trebuchets and the banners and the heroic assault, remember what the camera never shows you. The man in the crown standing in front of a ledger, watching his kingdom drain away one day of waiting at a time. The siege didn't end when the walls fell, it ended when the money ran out. And for more kings than history likes to admit, the money ran out long before the walls ever did.